think one of the most interesting parts of the national dialogue with President Johnson's 50th anniversary of his speech is most folks actually don't think about what he's really talking about and the fact that poverty is racialized. So he really draws on the social implications, but also the fact that many of those that are dealing with poverty issues are also people of color. And so, the government, if we think about history, for hundreds of years, the government actually prevented people of color from building wealth and having access to homeownership or voting, all the democratic ways that we as a nation continue to increase our wealth. And so, now looking into 2014 and beyond, the fact that people of color are growing in numbers and are becoming our majority population, it's the government's responsibility to fix the problems that we've created and be very intentional about how we go about doing so. Let's take the recent financial crisis. There's a lot of information that we just didn't know. And even today, when we think about recovery, oftentimes, again, national dialogue says that our economy is on the mend. We know that communities of color are still really hurting. So information like loan modifications, there isn't much information about who's getting access to loan modifications, the demographics of those folks. Also, when we think about entrepreneurship, which is an incredible way, again, for communities to build wealth and to increase access to jobs for communities of color, for low-income consumers, there's no or not much data that shows what's the distribution of loans, small business loans, again, by demographics or geography. So it's really important, in order to cast a wider net and some transparency with what's the problem, we got to know what's happening first and can't do that without the data. Having data that shows the distribution of small business loans to people of color. Right now, the only place you can get that data is from the Small Business Administration. It's only about 1% to 2% of small business loans by larger banks. And you have to go through hoops to even get that information. So that's one key point. And then also just, looking at increasing access to capital and creating policies that really recognize where businesses and where individuals are at, and really thinking outside of the box to streamline and make sure it's a little easier or more sustainable for folks to get access to capital. And contracts, since the government and also larger banks, for example, are spending billions of dollars buying paper clips and what we say procuring contracts for their day-to-day business. So for us, we always say homeownership, homeownership, homeownership. Access to homeownership is the critical way that people of color are able to build wealth. And so it's critically important. And so ensuring that there's a sustainable way to really bridge that divide is going to ensure that communities of color have access to building wealth over time. I'd say another piece of that is leadership. Leadership in Washington is lacking diversity and a sheer understanding of communities on the ground. So again, back to Lyndon Johnson, one of the points that he made is we really can't make meaningful change in the Beltway. It has to be on the ground. So folks from DC have to get out of DC, but also we need to work on increasing the representation of low to moderate income consumers and consumers of color and other markers of difference in Washington, DC to really, again, create those intentional policies where folks here understand, recognize what's actually happening to real people on the ground.